Did you know there's only one submarine in history that successfully attacked a train on land, not at sea, on actual land, inside enemy territory? And it happened in Japan during World War II. This is the story of the USS Barb and the most insane submarine raid ever pulled off. The USS Barb wasn't just any submarine, and Commander Eugene Fluckey wasn't just any captain. This guy was absolutely crazy in the best way possible. By July 1945, the Barb had already sunk more enemy ships than almost any other American submarine in the Pacific. But Fluckey wanted more. He wanted to do something nobody had ever done before, something so wild that when he proposed it, his own crew thought he'd lost his mind. Picture this. It's the summer of 1945. The war in the Pacific is winding down. Japan is getting destroyed from the air. American B-29s are firebombing Japanese cities almost every night. The Japanese Navy is basically gone. Most of their merchant ships have been sunk. Submarines like the Barb are running out of targets. For most submarine captains, that would be fine. Mission accomplished. Time to go home. But not Eugene Fluckey. This guy looked at the situation and thought, if there are no more ships to sink, what else can we blow up? And that's when he got the craziest idea in submarine warfare history. Fluckey studied intelligence reports about the Japanese coastline. He noticed that in some areas, railroad tracks ran very close to the shore, like really close, close enough that you could see trains from the water. And that's when the idea hit him. What if we could blow up a train from a submarine? Now understand how insane this sounds. Submarines are meant to operate in water. They're designed to sink ships. They have torpedoes, deck guns, and depth charges. They don't have the equipment or training to conduct land operations. There's no manual for how to blow up trains with a submarine. It had never been done. Most people would say it's impossible, but Fluckey wasn't most people. He was a commander who had already done things other submarine captains thought were impossible. Earlier in the war, he had taken the Barb into heavily defended harbors and sunk ships right under the noses of Japanese shore batteries. He had survived depth charge attacks that would have destroyed other subs. His crew trusted him completely because he was smart, careful, and lucky. So when Fluckey announced his plan to blow up a train, the crew's first reaction was shock, then excitement. These guys had been at sea for months. They had faced death dozens of times. They were bored with just patrolling empty waters. The idea of doing something completely new, something that would go down in history, that was exciting. But there were huge problems with this plan. First, they would have to get extremely close to shore. Submarines are vulnerable in shallow water. If they ran aground, they'd be sitting ducks. Second, they would have to send men onto enemy territory. Into Japan itself, these weren't Marines or commandos. They were submarine sailors. They weren't trained for land operations. Third, they would have to plant explosives on railroad tracks without being detected. Japan was on high alert. There were coastal patrols everywhere, guard posts, searchlights. One wrong move and the whole mission would turn into a disaster. And fourth, assuming they managed to plant the explosives, they would have to get everyone back to the sub and escape before the Japanese Navy or Air Force showed up. The odds of success were maybe 50-50 at best. The odds of everyone surviving were even lower. But Fluckey was confident. He spent weeks planning every detail. He studied maps of the Japanese coastline. He identified a perfect target area in the Patience Bay region, near the town of Karafuto, on the east coast of Japanese-held Submarine Island. The area had railroad tracks running parallel to the coast. Trains passed through regularly carrying supplies for the Japanese military. The terrain provided some cover, and most importantly, it was isolated enough that the Japanese probably weren't expecting an attack. Why would they? Nobody attacks trains from submarines. Fluckey picked 8 volunteers from his crew to go ashore. These men would form the landing party. They would paddle to shore in a small raft, hike to the railroad tracks, plant explosives, and get back to the sub before anyone noticed. It sounds simple when you say it like that, but every step was incredibly dangerous. The men chosen for the mission were excited and terrified at the same time. They spent days practicing, they learned how to use explosives, they practiced moving silently. They memorized the plan over and over until everyone knew exactly what to do. Meanwhile, the Barb sailed toward Japanese waters. On the night of July 22, 1945, the USS Barb surfaced about 3,000 feet from the Japanese coast. It was pitch black, no moon, perfect conditions for a stealth mission. Flucky used the periscope to scout the area. He could see the railroad tracks in the distance. He could see buildings, lights from the town. This was it. The 8-man landing party assembled on deck. They wore dark clothing. They carried explosives, detonators, weapons, and a few tools. They climbed into a small rubber raft and started paddling toward shore. The rest of the crew watched from the submarine, knowing that if something went wrong, there wasn't much they could do to help. The raft moved slowly through the dark water. Every splash sounded too loud. Every movement felt exposed. The men kept looking back at the submarine, which was barely visible in the darkness. They kept looking ahead at the Japanese coast, expecting searchlights to snap on at any moment, but nothing happened. They reached the shore without being detected. Now came the hard part. The men pulled the raft onto the beach and hid it in some vegetation. Then they started moving inland. They had to cover several hundred yards to reach the railroad tracks. The ground was rough. There were rocks, bushes, and random obstacles. They moved slowly, carefully, trying not to make noise. Every few seconds they would stop and listen, looking for patrols, looking for dogs, looking for any sign that they had been spotted. But the coast seemed deserted. Maybe the Japanese thought they were safe this far north. Maybe they weren't expecting anyone to be crazy enough to attack them here. Whatever the reason, luck was on the American side that night. After about 15 minutes of careful movement, they reached the railroad tracks. This was the moment of truth. They had practiced this dozens of times on the submarine. Now they had to do it for real. Under pressure, in enemy territory, with the clock ticking, the teams split into groups. Some men stood guard, watching for patrols. The others got to work on the explosives. They had brought 55 pounds of C2 plastic explosive. Their plan was to attach it to the tracks with a special pressure-activated detonator. When a train rolled over the tracks, the weight would trigger the explosion. Boom, instant derailment. But there was a problem. The detonator wasn't working right. Something about the mechanism wasn't functioning as it should. The men tried to fix it, but they were running out of time. They had been on land for almost 30 minutes. Every minute increased the risk of being discovered. One of the sailors, a guy named Billy Hatfield, who was an electrician, figured out a workaround. He jury-rigged the detonator using some wire and ingenuity. It wasn't pretty, but it would work. They attached the explosive to the tracks, set the detonator, and covered everything with dirt and rocks to hide it. From a distance, the tracks looked completely normal. The job was done. Now they had to get out of there. Fast. They moved back toward the beach, retracing their steps. Again, moving carefully. Again, expecting to hear shouts or gunfire at any moment. But there was only silence. They reached the beach, found their raft, and started paddling back to the submarine. Back on the Barb, Commander Flucky was watching through the periscope. He could barely see the raft in the darkness. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the landing party reached the submarine. They climbed aboard, exhausted and soaking wet. Everyone was accounted for. No injuries. No one had been spotted. Phase 1 of the mission was complete, but they weren't done yet. Now came the most exciting part. Flucky decided they would wait and see if the explosives actually worked. The submarine submerged to periscope depth and positioned itself where they could watch the railroad tracks. Then they waited. Hours passed. The sun started to rise. And then, in the distance, they saw it. A train, moving along the coast, heading straight toward the section of track where they had planted the explosives. Flucky called everyone to the periscope. The entire crew wanted to see this. The train got closer, closer. It was a freight train, probably carrying military supplies or equipment, 15 or 16 cars long, moving at a decent speed. The tension on the Barb was incredible. Would the explosives work? Would the detonator function? Or had they risked everything for nothing? The train reached the rigged section of track. There was a split second of nothing, then a massive explosion. The force of it was visible even from the submarine. The explosion tore the tracks apart and derailed the locomotive. Cars piled up behind it. Some tipped over. The whole train was wrecked, and the crew of the USS Barb erupted in cheers. They had done it. They had just become the only submarine in history to successfully attack a train on land, in enemy territory, without losing a single man. It was the most insane military achievement of the Pacific War. Flucky immediately ordered the submarine to dive deep and leave the area before the Japanese could respond. The mission was a complete success. When news of the raid reached American naval headquarters, people couldn't believe it. Some thought it was a joke. Others thought the report had been exaggerated, but it was all true. The USS Barb had actually blown up a train with a submarine in Japan during World War II. Commander Eugene Flucky was already a decorated officer before this mission, but after the train raid he became a legend. The Navy awarded him the Medal of Honor for his actions during the Barb's patrol missions. Not specifically for the train raid, because that was just one part of a much larger patrol, but it certainly didn't hurt his reputation. The crew of the USS Barb became celebrities. When they returned to port, they were treated like rock stars. Every sailor on board received medals and recognition. They had participated in one of the most daring and creative military operations of the entire war, and they had pulled it off perfectly. But what makes this story even more incredible is that the train raid wasn't even the craziest thing the USS Barb did during that patrol. Earlier in the same mission, Flucky had taken the submarine into Japanese harbors and fired rockets at shore installations. He had invented new tactics for submarine warfare that other captains started copying. He had sunk multiple ships and evaded countless enemy attacks. The guy was a tactical genius. The Japanese never figured out how their train got blown up. They suspected sabotage, obviously, but they probably thought it was Japanese resistance fighters or maybe Chinese guerrillas operating in the area. The idea that American submarine sailors had snuck onto shore, planted explosives and escaped without being detected probably never crossed their minds. Because it was impossible. Except it wasn't. The USS Barb story doesn't end with the train raid. The submarine continued to operate in Japanese waters until the end of the war. By the time it was all over, the Barb had sunk 17 enemy ships and destroyed dozens more with deck gun fire and rockets. It was one of the most successful submarines in the US Navy's history. After the war, Eugene Flucky continued his naval career. He eventually became an admiral. He wrote a book about his experiences called Thunder Below, which is one of the best submarine warfare memoirs ever written. In it, he describes the train raid and dozens of other missions in detail. The book is full of stories that seem too crazy to be true, but they all happened. The men who went ashore that night in July 1945 carried that experience with them for the rest of their lives. Imagine being able to tell people you're part of the only submarine crew in history to blow up a train on land in enemy territory and pull it off without anyone getting hurt. That's the kind of story you tell at every party for the next 50 years. What makes the USS Barb's train raid so special isn't just that it was successful, it's what it represents. It represents creativity in warfare. It represents thinking outside the box. It represents refusing to accept that something is impossible just because nobody has done it before. Commander Flucky looked at the situation and asked himself, what else can we do? Most people wouldn't ask that question. Most people would follow the manual, do what's expected, play it safe. But Flucky saw an opportunity to do something unique, something that would hurt the enemy and boost morale back home. And he took that chance. The raid also shows the importance of training and preparation. The landing party didn't just get lucky. They succeeded because they practiced, because they planned, because they thought through every possible problem and came up with solutions. When the detonator didn't work right, they didn't panic. They fixed it. That's professionalism, and it shows the power of bold leadership. Flucky could have said no. He could have decided the mission was too risky. His crew would have understood. Nobody expected him to blow up trains with a submarine, but he believed it could be done, and his confidence inspired his crew to believe it too. That's what great leaders do. They take calculated risks that others won't take. The train raid is also a reminder that World War II was full of incredible stories that most people never hear about. Everyone knows about D-Day, the Battle of Midway, the atomic bombs. Those are the big moments. But there were thousands of smaller stories just as impressive. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. The USS Barb's crew were ordinary guys, sailors from all over America, mechanics, electricians, cooks, radio operators. They weren't elite commandos, they weren't special forces, they were regular Navy submariners who happened to serve under a commander crazy enough to try something nobody had ever attempted, and they pulled it off. After the war, the USS Barb was eventually decommissioned. It served its country well and earned its place in naval history. Today, pieces of the submarine are on display at various museums. The ship's bell is at the Submarine Force Museum in Connecticut. People can see it and read about the Barb's incredible service record. There's also a memorial in Summersville, West Virginia, Commander Flucky's hometown. It honors his service and the crew of the USS Barb. Every year, veterans and naval enthusiasts gather there to remember one of the greatest submarine commanders in American history and the men who served with him. The story of the USS Barb and the train raid has been told in books, documentaries, and articles. It's been featured on the History Channel and other educational programs. It's taught at the Naval Academy as an example of creative thinking and bold leadership. But it's still not as well known as it should be. Most people have never heard about the submarine that blew up a train. Part of the reason is that submarine warfare during World War II doesn't get as much attention as other aspects of the conflict. Everyone focuses on the battles that involve thousands of troops, the massive invasions, the air campaigns. Submarines operated in secret, alone in enemy waters, doing dangerous work that often went unrecognized. But submariners played a crucial role in winning the war in the Pacific. They cut off Japan's supply lines. They sank merchant ships carrying oil, food, and materials. They gathered intelligence. They rescued downed pilots. And in the case of the USS Barb, they attacked targets nobody thought submarines could reach. The success of the train raid also had a psychological impact. When word spread through the Pacific Fleet about what the Barb had done, it inspired other crews. It showed that there were still opportunities to hurt the enemy in creative ways. It reminded everyone that the war wasn't over yet, and that every mission mattered. For the Japanese, the train raid was a mystery and a concern. If Americans could attack trains this far inside Japanese-controlled territory, what else could they do? It added to the paranoia that was spreading through Japan as the war turned against them. Every unexplained explosion, every act of sabotage made them more nervous and stretched their resources thinner. The timing of the raid is also significant. This happened in July 1945, just weeks before the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war was about to end in the most dramatic way possible, but the men of the USS Barb didn't know that. For all they knew, the war could continue for months or even years. They were still taking risks, still fighting, still trying to win. That's another lesson from this story. You do your duty regardless of how close you are to the finish line. The crew of the Barb could have taken it easy. They had already achieved more than most submarines. They could have played it safe and waited for the war to end. Instead, they kept pushing, they kept taking risks, they kept looking for ways to hurt the enemy. Commander Flucky's leadership style was unique. He didn't rule by fear or intimidation. He led by example and included his crew in decision-making. When he proposed the train raid, he didn't order men to go. He asked for volunteers, and the fact that more men volunteered than he needed shows how much they trusted and respected him. He also made sure to recognize the contributions of individual crew members. When Billy Hatfield fixed the detonator, Flucky made sure everyone knew about it. When the lookout spotted targets, he thanked them. When the torpedo crew made difficult shots, he celebrated with them. That kind of leadership builds loyalty and morale. The story also highlights the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance. Flucky didn't just randomly pick a spot on the coast and hope for the best. He studied maps, read intelligence reports, and carefully selected a target that maximized success and minimized risk. Good planning made the difference between success and disaster. The men who went ashore that night showed incredible courage. They knew the risks. They knew that if something went wrong, they might not make it back. But they trusted their training, their teammates, and their commander. And that trust was rewarded. Everyone came home safely. There's something inspiring about the idea that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The crew of the USS Barb weren't superheroes. They were regular guys who signed up to serve their country. But when the opportunity came to do something remarkable, they rose to the challenge. That's the American spirit right there. That's what makes stories like this worth remembering. The train raid also demonstrates the effectiveness of unconventional warfare. Sometimes the best way to hurt an enemy isn't a massive frontal assault. Sometimes it's a small team doing something unexpected in a place the enemy thinks is safe. Special operations forces today use that same philosophy. Small teams, high-impact missions, in and out before the enemy knows what hit them. World War II was full of innovation, new weapons, new tactics, new technologies. The USS Barb's train raid was just one example of people thinking creatively about how to win. From code breaking to radar to amphibious assaults, the war pushed everyone to innovate constantly. The side that adapted fastest and thought most creatively usually won. It's also worth noting that this mission could have easily gone wrong. If the Japanese had discovered the explosives before the train arrived, the element of surprise would have been lost. If a patrol had spotted the landing party, there could have been a firefight. If the submarine had run aground in shallow water, it could have been destroyed. The fact that everything went perfectly was partly due to skill and partly due to luck. But that's warfare. You can plan everything perfectly and still have things go wrong. Or you can take a calculated risk and have everything go right. Flucky's genius was recognizing when the odds were in his favor and having the courage to act. He wasn't reckless, he was bold. There's a difference. The legacy of the USS Barb lives on in the US Navy today. Submarine commanders still study Flucky's tactics. The Naval Academy uses his missions as teaching examples. When young officers are learning about leadership and decision-making, the story of the train raid comes up. It's a perfect case study in creative thinking, bold action, and effective leadership. There have been other submarines named USS Barb since World War II. The Navy keeps certain ship names alive to honor their legacy. Every time a ship named Barb goes to sea, it carries with it the memory of that incredible patrol in 1945. It's a reminder of what submarines can accomplish and what sailors are capable of when properly led. For the families of the men who served on the original USS Barb, this story is a source of immense pride. Many of them have kept in touch over the years. They attend reunions, they share stories, They make sure the next generation knows what their fathers and grandfathers accomplished. That's how history stays alive, through stories passed down from one generation to the next. If you ever get the chance to visit a submarine museum, do it. See how cramped the conditions were. Imagine spending months at a time in a metal tube under the ocean, never seeing sunlight, always in danger. It gives you a new appreciation for what submariners went through. And it makes stories like the USS Barb's train raid even more impressive. The physical courage required to serve on a submarine during World War II was immense. Every time you submerged, you were trusting your life to the machinery and your crew. Every time you surfaced in enemy waters, you were exposed to attack. And every mission could be your last. The men of the USS Barb faced those dangers over and over and kept coming back for more. The train raid was the culmination of everything they had learned throughout the war. All the patrols, all the close calls, all the successful attacks, everything led to that moment when 8 sailors paddled to shore in Japan and did something that had never been done before. It was the perfect ending to an incredible combat patrol. When Commander Flucky and his crew finally returned home after the war, they were changed men. They had seen combat. They had faced death. They had done things they never imagined they would do, but they had also formed bonds that would last a lifetime. The kind of bonds that only come from shared danger and shared victory. Many of the crew stayed in the Navy after the war. Others returned to civilian life. But all of them carried the memories of their time on the USS Barb. They knew they had been part of something special. They knew they had served under one of the greatest submarine commanders in history. And they knew they had written a chapter of naval history that would never be forgotten. The story of how one American submarine blew up a train in Japan is more than just a cool war story. It's a lesson in creativity, courage, leadership, and teamwork. It's a reminder that impossible is just a word. It's proof that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they're properly led and willing to take risks. Commander Eugene Flucky passed away in 2007 at the age of 93. He lived a long, full life after the war, but he's remembered most for what he did during those dark years of World War II, for the ships he sank, the men he led, and the train he blew up from a submarine. Not bad for a career. The 8 men who went ashore that night in July 1945 all lived to old age. They told their story countless times over the years. To their kids, their grandkids, to historians and journalists. And every time they told it, you could see the pride in their eyes. They had done something nobody else in history had done. They had been part of the most impossible submarine raid ever pulled off. So the next time someone tells you something is impossible, remember the USS Barb. Remember Commander Flucky and his crew. Remember that sometimes the difference between impossible and done is just one person crazy enough to try. That's how history gets made, not by people who play it safe, but by people who see an opportunity and take it. The USS Barb's train raid wasn't the biggest battle of World War II. It didn't change the course of the war, but it mattered. It showed what American sailors were capable of. It demonstrated the power of creative thinking, and it gave us one of the best stories in military history. A story about a submarine that blew up a train. Because someone was brave enough to try. Comment what you think about this impossible mission and subscribe for more insane history stories nobody talks about.